The disappearance of Brandon Swanson. Imagine your 19-year-old son calls you at 2 a.m. His car is stuck in a ditch on a rural road. He's not injured, just needs help. You stay on the phone with him as you drive to pick him up. You talk for nearly an hour, guiding him, reassuring him, getting closer to where he is. He tells you he can see the lights of the town. He can see you coming. You're almost there. Just a few more minutes and this will all be over. Your son will be safe in your car, heading home. Then he says 2 words, "Oh shit." The phone goes dead. You call back immediately. No answer. You call again and again. Nothing. You search frantically in the darkness, calling his name, looking for any sign of him. But he's gone. Vanished. As if he was never there at all. And 15 years later, he's still gone. No body. No evidence. No explanation for what happened in the split second between "oh shit" and silence. This is the true story of Brandon Swanson, a college freshman from Marshall, Minnesota, who disappeared on May 14, 2008. He was on the phone with his parents when he vanished. They heard his last words. They were minutes away from reaching him. But despite one of the most extensive searches in Minnesota history, despite thousands of hours of investigation, despite the desperate efforts of his family and law enforcement, Brandon Swanson has never been found. What did he see in that final moment? What made him say "oh shit"? Where did he go? How does someone disappear while on the phone, in an area that was searched repeatedly, leaving absolutely no trace? This is a story about a young man who should have been easily found but wasn't. It's about parents who heard their son's last words but couldn't save him. It's about a mystery that defies logic, that has puzzled investigators for over a decade, and that continues to haunt everyone who hears it. May 14, 2008, started as an ordinary day for Brandon Victor Swanson. He was 19 years old, a freshman at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, Minnesota. Brandon was a good student, responsible, close to his family. He was the kind of young man parents didn't worry about too much. That evening, Brandon attended an end-of-year party with friends in Canby. It was a celebration, a chance to unwind after finals. Brandon wasn't a heavy drinker, but he did have some alcohol that night. Witnesses later said he seemed fine, not intoxicated to the point of impairment, just having a good time with friends. Around midnight, Brandon decided to head home to Marshall, about 30 miles away. He said goodbye to his friends, got into his white 1998 Chevy Lamina, and started driving. The route was familiar to him. He'd driven it many times. There was no reason to think this trip would be any different. But somewhere along the way, Brandon got lost or took a wrong turn. This wasn't entirely surprising. Rural Minnesota roads can be confusing at night, especially the grid of gravel roads that crisscross the agricultural landscape. In the dark, one road looks much like another, and it's easy to become disoriented. At 12:30 a.m., Brandon called his parents. His car had gone into a ditch. He wasn't hurt, but the car was stuck and he couldn't get it out. He needed them to come get him. Brandon's parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, immediately agreed to help. Brian asked where Brandon was. Brandon said he was just outside of Lind, a small town about 10 miles from Marshall. He described his location as being near the intersection of County Routes 3 and 113. Brian and Annette got in their car and started driving toward Lind. As they drove, they stayed on the phone with Brandon. This constant communication would later prove to be both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because it meant they were in contact for nearly an hour, a curse because it meant they heard everything that happened in his final moments. As Brian and Annette drove toward Lind, they kept asking Brandon to describe what he could see. He said he was in a field or near a field. He could see lights in the distance that he thought were Lind. He started walking toward those lights, thinking he could meet his parents somewhere rather than waiting by his stuck car. But there was a problem. Brian and Annette couldn't find Brandon's car. They drove along County Routes 3 and 113, looking for a white Chevy Lamina in a ditch. They flashed their headlights. They honked their horn. Brandon said he couldn't see or hear them. This didn't make sense. If Brandon was where he said he was, they should have been able to see each other. The area wasn't that large. On a quiet night in rural Minnesota, you should be able to see car headlights from miles away. Brian suggested Brandon might be confused about his location. Maybe he wasn't near Lind. Maybe he'd taken a wrong turn and ended up somewhere else. Brandon was certain he was near Lind, but he agreed to keep walking toward the lights he could see, assuming they would eventually intersect. For 47 minutes, Brandon walked through the dark Minnesota countryside while his parents drove around searching for him. They continued talking on the phone the entire time. Brandon described what he could see and hear. His parents did the same. They were trying to triangulate his position, to find some landmark or feature that would help them locate each other. Brandon mentioned walking through fields. He talked about climbing over fences. He said at one point that his feet were getting wet, suggesting he might be walking through wet ground or shallow water. But he kept moving, kept heading toward those lights he thought were Lind. Then, at 1:54 a.m., Brandon said something his parents would never forget. He said, "I'm going to head toward the lights I can see and I'll call you back." His parents protested. They wanted him to stay on the line. But Brandon seemed confident he knew where he was going now. He said he'd call them right back. Then he said those final words, "Oh shit." The phone went dead. Brian immediately tried calling back. The phone rang but Brandon didn't answer. He called again. And again. Each time, the phone rang, indicating it was on and had power, but Brandon never picked up. Annette tried calling. Same result. The phone worked, it rang, but their son didn't answer. What had happened? What did Brandon see or experience that made him say, "Oh shit"? Why did the phone cut off? And why, if the phone still worked, wasn't Brandon answering? Brian and Annette continued searching, now frantic. They drove up and down every road in the area, calling Brandon's name out their windows, looking for any sign of him. But there was nothing. No sound. No movement. No Brandon. At 6:30 a.m., after hours of searching on their own, Brian and Annette contacted the Leon County Sheriff's Office to report Brandon missing. The deputy they spoke to initially treated it as a routine matter. Brandon was an adult. Only a few hours were missing. He'd probably turn up soon. But Brian and Annette knew something was terribly wrong. Their son had vanished mid-conversation while they were on the phone with him. When law enforcement began investigating Brandon Swanson's disappearance, they immediately encountered a puzzling problem. Brandon's car wasn't where he said it was. Searchers eventually found Brandon's white Chevy Lumina, but not near Lind where he told his parents he was. Instead, the car was found in a ditch near Taunton, Minnesota, approximately 25 miles away from where Brandon thought he was. This discovery was shocking and perplexing. How could Brandon be so wrong about his location? Taunton is nowhere near Lind. They're in opposite directions from Canby, where Brandon had been partying. How does someone end up 25 miles from where they think they are? The car was examined. It was stuck in a ditch along a gravel road, just as Brandon had described. The keys were missing. Brandon had them with him. There was no damage beyond what you'd expect from going into a ditch. No signs of foul play. The car had simply slid off the road and gotten stuck. But the location changed everything about the search. If Brandon had started walking from his car near Taunton, and if he'd been walking for 47 minutes before he disappeared, he could have covered a significant distance. And he'd been walking in the wrong direction the entire time. Brandon had said he could see lights he thought were Lind. But if he was actually near Taunton, those lights might have been from Porter or Minneota, towns in the opposite direction. He'd been walking away from Marshall, away from help, away from the area his parents were searching. This meant the search area was much larger than initially thought. Brandon could be anywhere within a several-mile radius of where his car was found. And in rural Minnesota, that's a lot of ground to cover: farmland, fields, ditches, rivers, marshland. The Minnesota West Community and Technical College organized volunteer search parties. Hundreds of people showed up to help look for Brandon. They formed lines and walked through fields, checking every ditch, every culvert, every patch of trees. They used tracking dogs. They searched on foot, on horseback, and with ATVs. The searches were extensive and thorough. Every day for weeks, volunteers and law enforcement combed the area. They expanded the search radius, covering more and more territory. They checked abandoned buildings, farm structures, drainage ditches, anything and everything that might conceal a body or provide clues. They found nothing. No clothing. No phone. No wallet. No sign that Brandon had ever been there. Search dogs tracked Brandon sent from his car to the Yellow Medicine River, about a mile and a half away. The dogs seemed to lose the scent at the riverbank, suggesting Brandon might have entered the water. This made sense with his comment about his feet getting wet. But searchers of the river and its banks found nothing. Divers checked the deeper sections. Search teams walked along the shore for miles in both directions. If Brandon had fallen in the river and drowned, his body should have been found, especially as time passed and natural processes would bring a body to the surface. The Yellow Medicine River became a focal point of the investigation. It's a relatively small river, not particularly deep or fast-moving in most sections. Could Brandon have fallen in and drowned? It's possible. But even if he had, why wasn't his body found? Weeks passed. Then months. The intensive searches were scaled back, though law enforcement continued investigating. Brandon's family never gave up. His father Brian became particularly dedicated to finding his son, organizing searches, following up on every tip, every theory, every possible lead. One theory that emerged was that Brandon had fallen into an old well or abandoned agricultural structure. Rural Minnesota has numerous old wells, some covered, some not properly secured. If Brandon had fallen into one in the dark, he could have been injured or killed, and his body might never be found if the well was deep or filled in. Searchers used ground-penetrating radar to look for anomalies in the ground that might indicate an old well or underground structure. They checked property records looking for documented wells in the area. They investigated every potential site. Again, they found nothing. Another possibility was that Brandon had fallen into a grain bin or agricultural silo. Some of these structures can be dangerous, especially if someone falls into stored grain, which can act like quicksand. But checks of grain storage facilities in the area revealed no signs of Brandon. As the searches continued without results, investigators began to consider other possibilities. Was Brandon's disappearance voluntary? Had he staged the accident and phone call to disappear deliberately? This seemed unlikely given his relationship with his family and the lack of any obvious motive, but it couldn't be entirely ruled out. Was foul play involved? Had Brandon encountered someone in those dark fields who'd harmed him? But there was no evidence of anyone else being in the area. No vehicles were seen. No suspicious persons were reported. And why would someone who'd just harmed Brandon answer his ringing phone to know not to pick up, yet leave the phone on? The case attracted national attention. Brandon's story was featured on Disappeared, the investigation Discovery Channel program dedicated to missing persons cases. His family appeared on news programs appealing for information. His face was on missing person posters across Minnesota and beyond. But despite the attention, despite the searches, despite the investigations, no breakthrough came. Brandon Swanson remained missing, and the mystery of what happened to him remained unsolved. 15 years have passed since Brandon Swanson disappeared. In that time, numerous theories have been proposed to explain what happened to him. Each theory has supporters and skeptics, evidence supporting it and problems undermining it. Let's examine the major theories. Theory 1. Accidental drowning in the Yellow Medicine River. This is perhaps the most widely accepted theory among investigators. The evidence supporting it includes the tracking dog's lost Brandon scent at the Yellow Medicine River, suggesting he entered the water. Brandon mentioned his feet getting wet, which could have been him walking along the riverbank or into shallow water. The timing and location match up. He could have reached the river after walking for 47 minutes from his car. Perhaps Brandon reached the river and attempted to cross it in the dark. Perhaps he didn't realize how deep it was or how slippery the banks were. Perhaps he fell in, was swept downstream, and drowned before he could call out or get back to shore. The "oh shit" could have been his reaction to realizing he was falling or in danger. The phone call ending abruptly makes sense if the phone got wet or if Brandon dropped it as he fell. Problems with this theory. Multiple extensive searches of the river found no body. Bodies in water typically surface due to decomposition gases, especially in a relatively small, slow-moving river. Brandon's body should have been found within days or weeks if he drowned. Also, Brandon was on the phone with his parents and had been describing his surroundings. Wouldn't he have mentioned if he was about to cross a river? Wouldn't he have been more cautious approaching water in the dark? Theory 2. Fell into an abandoned well or agricultural hazard. Rural areas often contain hidden dangers. Old wells, cisterns, grain bins, drainage systems. If Brandon fell into one of these in the dark, he might not have been found despite extensive searches. Supporting evidence. This would explain the "oh shit" and the sudden end to the call. It would explain why no body has been found. He could be in a deep well or underground structure that wasn't discovered. The ground-penetrating radar searches might have missed the specific location where he fell. Problems. Extensive searches using ground-penetrating radar and thorough examination of the area should have found any such hazards. Property records were checked for documented wells. If Brandon had fallen into something large enough to hide his body all these years, searchers should have found it. Theory 3. Disorientation and exposure. Some have suggested Brandon became disoriented, perhaps due to mild intoxication, fatigue, or the disorienting nature of walking through dark, unfamiliar rural areas. He might have wandered far from where searchers looked, eventually dying from exposure. Supporting evidence. Brandon was clearly confused about his location. He thought he was near Lind when he was actually near Taunton. This level of disorientation could have continued. If he wandered for hours in the wrong direction, he could have ended up far from the search areas. Rural Minnesota nights can be cold even in May. If Brandon walked for hours, became exhausted, and lay down to rest, hypothermia could have killed him. His body might be in an area that wasn't searched or in dense brush that obscured it from view. Problems. The extensive search area should have covered anywhere Brandon could have reasonably walked. Aerial searches, ground searches, and dog searches covered a massive area. A body exposed to the elements should have been found, especially as decomposition progressed. Theory 4. Fell and was injured. Perhaps Brandon fell into a ditch, culvert, or depression in the ground, sustaining injuries that prevented him from calling out or moving. He might have died from his injuries and his body wasn't found because it was in an unexpected location. Supporting evidence. The "oh shit" could have been him realizing he was falling. A fall could cause the phone to disconnect if it hit the ground or got damaged. If he was injured and couldn't move, he might have died from his injuries or exposure even if he survived the initial fall. Problems. Again, the extensive searches should have found him. A body in a ditch or culvert, even if initially missed, should eventually have been discovered by farmers working the land, by animals, by weather exposing the remains. Theory 5. Foul play. This theory suggests Brandon encountered someone in those dark fields who harmed him. Perhaps it was a random encounter. Perhaps someone with malicious intent was in the area. Supporting evidence. The "oh shit" could have been Brandon's reaction to seeing someone or something threatening. The phone cutting off could have been the result of an attack. If someone harmed Brandon and disposed of his body carefully, it might explain why he was never found. Some have suggested Brandon might have stumbled upon illegal activity, drug operations, illegal hunting, someone doing something they didn't want witnessed. If he surprised someone engaged in criminal activity, they might have harmed him to prevent being reported. Problems. There's no evidence of anyone else being in the area. No vehicles were reported. No suspicious persons were seen. Brandon was talking to his parents the entire time and never mentioned seeing anyone or feeling threatened. Additionally, if someone harmed Brandon, why didn't they take or destroy his phone? Why would they leave it on, allowing it to be tracked? And how did they dispose of his body so completely that no trace has been found in 15 years? Theory 6. Voluntary disappearance. A less popular theory suggests Brandon deliberately disappeared, that he staged the accident and phone call to start a new life somewhere else. Supporting evidence. Brandon was an adult capable of making his own decisions. Perhaps he had reasons to leave, problems we don't know about, desires to start over, pressures he couldn't handle. Staging a disappearance in a way that makes it look like an accident or mystery could help ensure he wasn't actively searched for after a certain point. Problems. Everything we know about Brandon contradicts this. He was close to his family, had no apparent problems, was doing well in school. He had no access to significant money or resources that would allow him to establish a new life. And most tellingly, why would someone who wants to disappear stay on the phone with their parents for 47 minutes, keeping them informed of their location the entire time? Theory 7. Animal attack. Though less commonly discussed, some have wondered if Brandon encountered a dangerous animal, a bull in a field, a pack of dogs, or potentially even wildlife. Supporting evidence. Brandon was walking through agricultural land. Farmers sometimes have bulls or protective dogs in their fields. If Brandon climbed a fence into a field with an aggressive animal, the "oh shit" could have been his reaction to the encounter. Problems. Animal attacks typically leave evidence, blood, torn clothing, signs of struggle. Search dogs would have found scent markers. And it's unlikely an animal attack would result in a body disappearing completely with no trace. Theory 8. Mental break or medical emergency. Some have theorized Brandon might have experienced a sudden medical emergency, a seizure, heart attack, stroke, or some other sudden health crisis. Or perhaps a psychotic break or altered mental state caused him to behave irrationally. Supporting evidence. A sudden medical emergency could explain the "oh shit" and sudden end to the call. If Brandon collapsed from a medical issue, he might have been unable to answer his phone despite it still ringing. If he had a mental break, He might have wandered far from the area in an irrational state. Problems. Brandon had no known medical conditions. The autopsy performed on his body. Except there is no body, so no autopsy could be done. This theory, like others, struggles to explain why no remains have been found. Brandon Swanson has been missing for over 15 years. In that time, his family has never stopped searching, never stopped hoping for answers. Brandon's Law, also known as Minnesota's Missing Persons Bill, was passed in 2009 largely due to the advocacy of Brandon's parents. The law requires law enforcement to begin immediate investigation of missing persons reports regardless of the person's age or the length of time they've been missing. Previously, there were delays in beginning searches for missing adults, as there often are in missing persons cases. Brandon's Law changed that in Minnesota. The passage of this law is Brandon's legacy, a way his disappearance has helped others. But for his family, it's small comfort. They don't want a law named after their son. They want their son back. Brian Swanson has become something of an expert on missing persons cases, volunteering with search organizations, offering support to other families facing similar situations. He organizes annual searches for Brandon, keeping the case active in public consciousness. Every year on the anniversary of Brandon's disappearance, volunteers gather to search again, to cover areas that might have been missed, to follow up on new theories or tips. These searches have become smaller over the years as hope dims and volunteers move on to other causes. But they continue. Brian won't give up. He's convinced that Brandon is out there somewhere, that one day someone will find something that will finally provide answers. Annette Swanson deals with her grief differently, maintaining Brandon's room as he left it, keeping his memory alive in private ways, struggling with the nightmare of not knowing what happened to her son. The not knowing, she said, is the hardest part. If they had a body, they could grieve, could bury their son, could have closure. But without that, they're trapped in an eternal present where Brandon is both gone and possibly still alive somehow. Over the years, there have been several potential breaks in the case that ultimately led nowhere. In 2013, search teams used advanced ground-penetrating radar technology to search the area again. They found several anomalies that warranted investigation, areas where the ground density suggested there might be voids or buried objects. Each was carefully excavated. None yielded any evidence related to Brandon. In 2014, a psychic contacted the family claiming to have visions about Brandon's location. While police don't typically take psychic tips seriously, the family was desperate enough to follow up. The psychic's information led nowhere. Several times over the years, remains have been found in Minnesota that sparked hope they might be Brandon. Each time, forensic testing proved they were not. Each time, the family's hope was raised and then crushed again. There have been reported sightings of someone matching Brandon's description in various locations around the country. Each was investigated. None were credible. In recent years, new technology has been brought to bear on the case. Advanced drone searches with thermal imaging have covered the area from above. Sonar equipment has been used to search waterways and lakes. Dogs trained specifically for finding deceased persons have been deployed. Still nothing. The case remains officially unsolved and active. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension maintains Brandon's case file. Any tips or information are still investigated, though the flow of new information has slowed to a trickle. Brandon would be 34 years old now if he's alive. He could have a career, a family, a life. But most people, including likely his own parents though they hold on to hope, believe Brandon died that night in May 2008. The question isn't whether he's alive but where his remains are and what exactly happened in those final moments. Some missing persons cases have been solved decades after the disappearance. Sometimes a hiker stumbles across remains in a remote area. Sometimes a deathbed confession reveals the truth. Sometimes advancements in technology allow old evidence to be analyzed in new ways, yielding answers that weren't possible before. This is what Brandon's family hopes for, that someday, somehow, they'll get answers. That they'll be able to bring Brandon home, to properly say goodbye, to know the truth about what happened on that dark Minnesota night. Conclusion: the unanswered mystery, the disappearance of Brandon Swanson, is one of the most perplexing missing persons cases in American history. Every aspect of it seems designed to frustrate understanding. He was on the phone with his parents when he vanished, yet they couldn't reach him in time. He disappeared in a rural area that's been exhaustively searched, yet no trace of him has been found. His last words, "Oh shit," suggest he saw or experienced something unexpected, yet we have no idea what it was. His phone kept working after he disappeared, ringing but unanswered, as if he chose not to answer but couldn't have chosen that. The case has all the elements of an urban legend: the late-night phone call, the mysterious disappearance, the haunting last words, the complete absence of evidence. But it's not a legend. It's real. Brandon Swanson was a real person who really disappeared, and his family really has to live with not knowing what happened to him. What did Brandon see in that final moment? Did he fall into water or a hidden danger? Did he encounter someone or something threatening? Did he have a medical emergency? Did he simply wander off in a confused state and die of exposure in a location that hasn't been found? We may never know. And that uncertainty, that lack of resolution, is what makes this case so haunting. Because it could happen to anyone. Brandon wasn't doing anything particularly risky or dangerous. He got his car stuck, called his parents for help, and tried to walk to meet them. Normal, reasonable, responsible behavior. And yet he vanished. If it could happen to Brandon, it could happen to anyone. And that's terrifying. Brandon's case reminds us how vast and empty rural areas can be, how easy it is to disappear even in what seems like a small, searchable area. It reminds us how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change, how someone can be there one moment and gone the next. For Brandon's family, the mystery continues. They're still waiting for answers, still hoping that one day the phone will ring with news. They're still trapped in that moment when Brandon said "oh shit" and the line went dead, forever waiting to know what came next. What happened to Brandon Swanson? Where is he? These questions echo across 15 years, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. And in the dark fields of rural Minnesota, the mystery remains.